The tobacco industry and pop psychology have spent years selling you the myth that smoking is just a bad habit, a stylistic choice, or your own conscious decision. That is a lie. Evolution proves. Thousands of years ago, around primitive campfires, early humans didn't inhale smoke for the flavor. It was a rigid ritual of submission to the tribal chieftain and the collective. Right now, we are going to perform a cold-blooded psychoanalysis and expose the mental black holes that a smoker desperately tries to patch up with every single drag, breaking their subconscious down to absolute atoms. To capture the true baseline of this addiction, we must push aside standard physical arguments and dissect Sigmund Freud's concepts without censorship. The entire psychology of a smoker rests squarely on the concept of oral fixation. When an infant is born, their entire world is narrowed down to a single point. The very first primitive instinct of safety in their life is the mother's breast or a pacifier. At this exact moment, the child's brain locks in an ironclad connection. If there is something in my mouth, it means I am fed, I am safe, and nothing can threaten me.
Now, let's observe what happens when this child grows into an adult. Colliding with brutal social pressure, financial strain, or a paralyzing fear of the future, the adult experiences deep existential stress. Their conscious mind fails to cope, and the psyche immediately trips an emergency override. Subconscious regression. The brain panics and rolls back to its most primitive, infantile defense mechanism. It literally screams, "I am terrified. Put me back into the infant state."
And so, the individual reaches for a cigarette, a vape, or a heated tobacco stick. Pay close attention to the mechanics itself. The deep inhalation, the drag, the physical fixation of the object in the mouth. At this exact microsecond, the nicotine hasn't even had time to hit the receptors, yet the smoker is already exhaling with a massive sigh of relief. Why? Because their tricked brain just simulated primitive, embryonic peace for 5 minutes. You aren't relaxing because of the chemical properties of the smoke. You are simply sucking on a surrogate pacifier because you remain a terrified adult who never actually learned to cope with reality without mental crutches.
The second hidden motive is hardwired directly into our genetic code. The deepest, most primitive nightmare of any human being is the paralyzing fear of being exiled from the pack. In the wild, being left completely alone always meant a swift and certain death. This is precisely why the modern smoking area in an office or a university is an exact carbon copy of the ancient tribal campfire.
We are dissecting people who use smoking as a cheap substitute for charisma and a social crutch. They are utterly incapable of entering closed groups, building networks, or communicating with authority figures directly. They are terrified. A cigarette becomes a legal passport into the inner circle of power. The excuse of "got a light" slashes the price of social risk straight down to zero. A person buys a pack for the sole purpose of gaining a legitimate right to stand next to those whom they would never dare approach without this chemical doping. Furthermore, smoking is the only socially approved method for a slave of the system to legitimately declare to the surrounding world, "Do not touch me. I am occupied." In the frantic rhythm of the megalopolis, you do not have the right to simply stand up in the middle of the workday and stare at a wall for 5 minutes. You will be labeled a slacker. But if you hold a smoking piece of plastic or paper in your hands, you are suddenly untouchable. A smoker's brain exploits this ritual as a defective surrogate analog of micro-meditation. This is a rigid psychological marker. The individual is utterly incapable of constructing personal boundaries and protecting their mental space. They vitally demand a physical object between their fingers just to acquire a legal right to pause, escape the workload, and remain alone with their thoughts. Without a cigarette, their psyche is simply powerless to say the word no to the world.
Now, let us cross over into the territory of dark psychology. Let's admit the glaringly obvious. A smoker is no fool. He clearly sees the gruesome images of rotted organs plastered on the packs, knows the oncology statistics, and fully understands that he is murdering himself with his own money. So why does he continue? Sigmund Freud explained this through the concept of thanatos, the subconscious human drive toward death and self-destruction.
When we expose these hidden motives, it becomes undeniable. The purchase of every new pack is a regular microact of controlled autoaggression. The individual is subconsciously punishing his own body. Deep inside him lives a heavy, deep-seated guilt stemming from past failures, childhood traumas, or a brutal mismatch with his internal ego ideal. He is disgusted by who he has become. But instead of altering his life, his psyche opts for a slow, protracted suicide. Every single drag is a silent manifesto of self-hatred, tightly masked as a momentary pleasure. The fifth layer of this pathology is the infantile internal rebel syndrome. Think back to how the vast majority of people take their very first drag. It almost always occurs between the ages of 15 and 17. Back then, a cigarette was the cheapest and fastest vehicle to launch a protest against the system, the school, suffocating teachers, and parental control. For a teenager, it was an effortless visual code declaring, "Look at me. I am independent. I am an adult now." But why does this exact pattern remain deeply welded into the brains of successful men and women at 30 or 40 years old? The answer is deeply cynical. It is a marker of profound psychological infantilism. When a grown adult storms out for a smoke break after a brutal conversation with their boss, or hides on a balcony with an electronic cigarette, their subconscious is simply continuing to play that exact same resentful teenager. He is fundamentally incapable of proving his strength, independence, and dominance through real-world achievements, substantial wealth, or an ironclad character. He lacks weight in the real world, and so the psyche pulls its favorite, familiar stunt. It fishes that old teenage crutch out of its pocket. The individual wraps himself in smoke, subconsciously projecting a delusion of toughness, while his real life cracks at the seams from sheer immaturity. Now let us ascend to the absolute peak of dopamine evolution and break down the ultimate blunder of the modern vapor. The industry has masterfully packaged poison inside sleek, colorful plastic, tasting like ripe berries, engineering the most lethal psychological trap of the 21st century. If a classic smoker is heavily restricted by the literal physics of the process, a cigarette burns down in 5 minutes, it reeks, and it forces you to step outside. The vapor completely loses all internal brakes. He sucks on this glossy plastic continuously, behind the steering wheel of his car, in front of a computer monitor, during a phone conversation, and even in bed at night. We are dissecting the psychology of people who have turned their own brains into a scorched dopamine desert. They have completely lost the capacity to endure even 5 minutes of mental vacuum, pure silence, or basic boredom. The microsecond their brain is left without an external stimulus, absolute panic sets in. Instead of processing the stress or generating a deep thought, they frantically shove synthetic chemical dopamine into their mouths. This is the psychology of absolute slaves to the second, who have entirely annihilated their own concentration just so they never have to remain face to face with their real, empty reality.
Let us draw the line.
Smoking is never about physiology, physical cravings, or the taste of tobacco. It is a visible marker of the broken internal mechanisms of your psyche and a mental crutch that you frantically cling to every single day. You can keep lying to yourself with bedtime stories about relaxation, but the truth remains deeply cynical. Every single drag exposes your hidden deficits, your deep infantilism, and your absolute panic in the face of the real world. You spend years waiting for an elevator in a building where growth demands a steep staircase of psychological risk.
And now, a direct question for those who are actually ready to rip off the masks. What is a cigarette to you in reality? A pathetic attempt to hide from anxiety inside an infantile oral fixation? Or a childish, foolish rebellion against reality? Write honestly in the comments section. Ruthlessly expose your true motives.